In the hot summer of 1851, a strange pattern appeared in eastern Texas that would haunt plantation records for many years. 7 slave owners, from Harrison County to Cherokee County, died in ways that no doctor could explain at the time. Each had bought the same man, and each died within weeks of the deal. In county records, each death was recorded with the same phrase: sudden failure of constitution. The authorities buried more than just bodies in those records. They buried a truth so disturbing that it would stay sealed in courthouse basements until the buildings themselves fell apart. The man who did it never raised a weapon, poisoned a well, or left a traceable mark. Instead, he killed his owners with such precision that he became something the plantation system had never seen before: a slave who could not be owned. Before we go on with the story of Samuel Kincaid, the only enslaved man to move through 7 plantations and leave 7 widows behind, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. This channel shows you the darkest parts of American history that textbooks won't talk about. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're in when you listen to this story. It touches every part of the South, and I want to know how you feel about what Samuel really did. During the spring cotton auction of 1,850 inches, Marshall, Texas, the man who would later be known as the Widowmaker first appeared. Marshall was at the center of everything that made antebellum Texas both profitable and paranoid, even though his origins were purposely kept secret in bills of sale that listed 3 different birth states and 4 different ages. As the county seat of Harrison County, it was the last major stop before the Louisiana border, where cotton, timber, and people moved through on their way to markets in New Orleans. By 1850, the town was rich from cotton, and brick courthouses had taken the place of wooden ones. Plantation houses spread like monuments to King Cotton across the piney woods. The Cato Lake area had access to water, the soil was rich in clay that kept moisture during the hot summers, and the railroad was coming, but it wouldn't get there until after the war changed everything. There were about 2,000 white people living in Marshall, and another 3,000 enslaved people worked on the nearby plantations. The social structure worked like a church hierarchy. At the top were old Texas families who had fought in the Revolution, then Georgia and Carolina transplants who had brought their slaves and cotton knowledge, then land speculators and overseers, then poor whites who owned nothing but their skin color, and finally, the enslaved, who legally owned nothing at all. Thomas Caffrey, a second-generation plantation owner whose father had claimed 600 acres during the Mexican period, came into this world. People in the area called Caffrey's business a moderate establishment. He had 32 slaves working 300 acres of cotton, and during lean years he made extra money by selling timber. He was known as a practical man who wasn't very cruel or very kind. He was the kind of owner who counted his profits down to the penny and cared about his workers as much as he did about his mules. 2 years before, Caffrey's wife had died of a fever, leaving him with a 9-year-old daughter named Catherine and a home that showed the effects of being a widow. He stuck to a strict budget, stayed away from drinking and gambling, which ruined other planters, and went to the Methodist church every week like a man who thought that God rewarded discipline with wealth. Caffrey rode into Marshall on the 14th of April 1850 with $600 in banknotes. He wanted to buy 2 field hands to replace workers he had sold the previous fall to pay off debts from a bad harvest. The auction took place in the lot behind the Harrison County Courthouse. A temporary platform served as the selling block, and buyers looked over the goods with the trained eyes of men who had been judging human bodies since they were kids. Lot number 7 was Samuel Kincaid. The auctioneer's description said he was a male Negro, about 28 years old, field-trained, with no distinguishing marks or defects, and papers showing clean title from a New Orleans dealer. The papers didn't say that Samuel had been sold 4 times in the previous 2 years, each time after his owner died unexpectedly, because the New Orleans dealer had carefully left that out. Thomas Caffrey paid $420 for Samuel, which was a fair price that didn't suggest either high quality or shady goods. The bill of sale was signed, witnessed, and put in the county ledger with the same bureaucratic speed that was used to record every business deal in Marshall. Samuel got off the platform and followed his new owner to a wagon that was already full of supplies. He didn't fight back or show any emotion. The trip to the Caffrey plantation took 3 hours. The roads changed from packed dirt to rutted trails as they went deeper into the piney woods. Caffrey didn't say much, just gave basic information about the layout of the quarters and what was expected of them at work. When spoken to, Samuel answered in the way he was supposed to, with his eyes appropriately lowered. What Thomas Caffrey didn't see, what maybe no white man could see because the social order told them not to, was how Samuel paid attention to everything. The distance between the main house and the quarters, the location of the overseer's cabin, the rhythm of the plantation's daily routine, the relationships between the other enslaved people, the places where authority was enforced, and the places where it just assumed compliance. Samuel was given a cabin to share with 2 other field hands, a blanket, and a weekly supply of cornmeal and salt pork. The next morning, he was put to work in the cotton fields. No one was worried about how he acted over the next 6 weeks. He worked hard, but not exceptionally, didn't talk much, and didn't cause any trouble. Wallace Pouet, the overseer who had worked for the Caffreys since before Thomas inherited the land, wrote in his records that Thomas was satisfactory but not outstanding. But the other enslaved people saw something that the white men didn't. Samuel asked questions, but not the dangerous ones that questioned authority. Instead, he asked careful questions that mapped out relationships and routines. He learned who was favored, who was punished, who had tried to run away, and who had been broken by the system. He found out that Caffrey had headaches that kept him in bed for days, that he took laudanum for the pain, and that his daughter mixed his medicine and ran most of the housework while he was sick. He found out that the Caffrey plantation ran on credit from Marshall merchants, that the harvest from the year before had barely paid off debts, and that Thomas Caffrey was a man who was financially unstable and couldn't afford another bad season. That night, the 2nd of June, 1850, Thomas Caffrey went to bed because he had one of his usual headaches. Catherine, his daughter, brought him his usual dose of laudanum mixed with water, which he had done hundreds of times before. He drank it, told her to go away, and then lay down in bed to wait for the medicine to kick in. Thomas Caffrey was dead by morning. Catherine knocked on her father's door to bring him breakfast at dawn, but he didn't answer. The door was open. It was always open because who needed to lock doors in their own house when they had their own stuff to protect? She found him in bed, lying on his back with his eyes half open. The morning air that came in through open windows smelled like pine resin and was already cooling his body. Catherine's scream brought the house staff running. Within minutes, Wallace Pouet sent a rider to Marshall to get Dr. Ambrose Whitfield, the only trained doctor within 20 miles. 3 hours later, the doctor showed up, rode hard enough to make his horse sweat, and did an exam that he would write about in great detail in his personal journal. Whitfield wrote, "Patient discovered in state of rigor mortis, approximately 6 to 8 hours post-mortem. No signs of violence on the body, no strange skin discoloration, and no smell that could have come from poisoning by common substances. The pupils were fixed and dilated. The expression on the face suggests that the person died peacefully in their sleep, not in pain or fear." When I asked the daughter, I found out that the deceased had taken his usual evening dose of laudanum for chronic head pain. An empty medicine glass was found on the bedside table, unwashed. The cause of death seems to be sudden heart or breathing failure, possibly caused by apoplexy or some sudden internal rupture. Given the patient's history of chronic head pain, I suspect that the underlying condition finally proved fatal. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion for 1,850 medicine, which didn't know much about sudden cardiac events or the subtle ways a body could be made to stop working. Doctor? Whitfield signed a death certificate that said the cause of death was failure of constitution. He then left with his $5 fee, leaving behind a plantation in a state of chaos. 3 days later, the funeral was held at the Methodist Church, where Thomas Caffrey was buried next to his wife in the churchyard. Catherine was now an orphan and in charge of the plantation, but because of the laws that made it hard for unmarried women to run things, she had to rely on her father's lawyer, Benjamin Hargrove, who had been in charge of the Caffrey family's legal matters for 20 years. The plantation itself went into the strange limbo that happens to any slaveholding class when someone dies suddenly. The work went on because it had to cotton, doesn't care about funerals, but the chain of command had cut off its own head. Wallace Pouet ran the business on a day-to-day basis, but he couldn't make financial decisions or buy supplies. Catherine could tell the slaves who worked in the house what to do, but she couldn't tell them what to do in the field. Attorney Hargrove came to the Caffrey plantation twice a week to go over the accounts and expenses. Over time, he came to the same conclusion as every other creditor in Marshall. The plantation was bankrupt. 2 months after Thomas Caffrey died, his estate was sold at auction. A group of Marshall merchants bought the land and paid off their debts. Everything in the house, the farm tools, and the animals were sold. And 32 people stood on the courthouse auction block again. Among them was Samuel Kincaid, who had been on the Caffrey plantation for exactly 11 weeks. Robert Chandler was the second buyer. Chandler's business was bigger than Caffrey's. 800 acres with 67 slaves, a 2-story house with furniture from other countries, and goals that matched his income. He moved to Texas from Alabama in 1847 with his slaves and his farming knowledge. He had done well enough to have a say in county politics. He was 42 years old, married with 3 kids, a deacon at the Baptist church, and a man who thought that slavery was not only profitable but also morally right according to the Bible. He paid $380 for Samuel, which was $40 less than what Caffrey had paid. This was because estate sales were always cheaper than market auctions. He then took him to a plantation that ran like a well-oiled machine. Chandler ran what he called a rational system. He kept detailed records, set punishments for breaking the rules, and thought that enslaved people would be more productive if they were disciplined all the time. He wasn't a sadist or a reformer. He was just a man who read agricultural journals and thought that good management could make things more efficient. Samuel got to the Chandler plantation on the 15th of August, 1850. He was put to work by an enslaver named Martin Yates, who had been born into slavery and then freed in his owner's will. Now he worked for the system that had once owned him. No one missed the bitter irony, except maybe Chandler, who saw Yates as proof that the system worked. He had been given his freedom as a reward for good service, hadn't he? Samuel worked on Chandler's fields for 6 weeks, watched him go about his business, and asked him careful questions. He found out that Chandler had ongoing stomach problems that he treated with calomel, mercury chloride, which he bought from the same doctor who had looked at Thomas Caffrey's body. He found out that Chandler kept detailed records of all of his income and expenses. These records showed that the plantation was making money, but it also had a lot of debt to New Orleans cotton factors. He found out that Chandler checked the quarters every Sunday after church to make sure there were no stolen goods, contraband, or signs of people resisting his authority. Robert Chandler said he had stomach pains after dinner on the night of the 28th of September, 1850. His wife gave him a dose of his usual calomel medicine, which she had made the same way dozens of times before. He took it, went to his study to look over his plantation ledgers, and 4 hours later, when they found him slumped over his desk, his skin was gray and pale, which his wife said made him look like he had been drained of blood. Dr. Whitfield was called back in to do another exam, which he wrote about in his journal with a little more worry than he had in his last entry. Patient found dead at desk. Death occurred 2 to 3 hours before discovery. Skin is unusually pale, and eyes are slightly yellow, which may indicate liver dysfunction. Patient had a history of digestive problems and regularly took calomel to treat them. Stomach contents were expelled before death, which was seen in a basin near the desk. Death appears to be consistent with sudden organ failure, possibly due to chronic digestive condition. Mercury poisoning was considered, but ruled out, as the patient had been taking calomel for years without incident. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution aggravated by chronic digestive disorder. Chandler had been a deacon at the Baptist church where the funeral was held. The estate went through probate, and 6 weeks later, the Chandler plantation was sold at auction. Samuel Kincaid was once again on the courthouse block, this time with the strange distinction of being sold from 2 estates in a row. The whispers began then, quiet talks between slaves on different plantations that were sent along the invisible communication network that linked all of the enslaved communities in the county. Samuel Kincaid had worked on 2 plantations, but both owners had died of natural causes within weeks of his arrival. It could mean nothing. It probably didn't mean anything. But people were starting to notice. Daniel Hartford was the 3rd buyer, and his purchase made the pattern clear. Daniel Hartford ran things differently than the people who came before him. Hartford, who moved from North Carolina to Texas during the Republic period, ran what he called a Christian plantation. This meant that he held prayer services for his slaves every Sunday, didn't let them work on the Sabbath, and thought that slavery was a sacred trust that came with responsibilities of care. He didn't hit his slaves. He had his overseer do it. Discipline was important, but it shouldn't be done out of anger. He didn't break up families unless he had to for financial reasons. He gave them enough food and clothes, which meant the bare minimum to keep them working well. Hartford's religious beliefs didn't affect how he ran his business. He owned 93 people and 1,000 acres of land. He ran a cotton gin that turned crops into money for smaller plantations. He also lent money to nearby farmers at interest rates that would make a Montgomery Street banker proud. He went to church 3 times a week, quoted scripture in everyday conversation, and truly believed he was one of God's chosen people, meant to be saved while doing his job of managing the lower races. Hartford bought Samuel Kincaid for $350 on the 12th of November, 1850. He had heard the rumors about the 2 previous owners, both of whom were dead. But Hartford didn't believe in superstition. He believed in providence. If God had chosen to call those men home, who was he to question what God wanted? Also, the price was right. The slave looked healthy and strong, and Hartford had never let rumors get in the way of making good business decisions. Samuel got to the Hartford plantation and was put in charge of the cotton gin, which was more skilled work than field work, and brought him closer to the plantation's business activities. He worked with 15 other enslaved people who ran the machines, processed the raw cotton, and loaded bales onto trucks to take them to the Marshall Shipping Depot. Hartford himself spent 3 days a week at the gin, where he oversaw operations and met with the small farmers who brought their crops to be processed. He was a visible presence, a man who thought that keeping an eye on things personally would stop theft and waste. He also thought that Christians should set a good example, so he didn't drink, gamble, or hang out with women other than his wife. He also kept his house clean, which he thought was important. Hartford didn't know his religious beliefs kept him from seeing that the woman who cooked his meals and kept his house clean was a slave. Rachel had worked in the Hartford kitchen for 12 years, ever since she was a teenager, and was bought at an estate sale in Louisiana. She cooked every meal, measured every ingredient, and kept the food stores in order like someone who knew that making a mistake would mean punishment. Rachel noticed that Samuel was starting to ask questions about how things worked around the house. She saw when he asked about Mr. Hartford's health, habits, and schedule. And she noticed, but didn't say anything, when Samuel started volunteering to help in the kitchen garden, where he learned which herbs were used for cooking and which were kept for medicine. Daniel Hartford had his usual breakfast of eggs, ham, grits, and coffee on the 7th of January, 1851. He went to his office to take care of business, where he looked over accounts and met with a small farmer about a loan for crops. He had his usual lunch of bread and cold meat. He fell down around 3:00 inches the afternoon while talking to his boss about a shipment of cotton. The overseers later account to Dr. Whitfield said that Hartford had seemed fine at first, but then he couldn't catch his breath. His face went from red to purple. He held his chest, gasped something that could have been a prayer, and fell to the ground. When they got him to the house and called the doctor, Daniel Hartford was already dead. His face still had the purple discoloration that showed he had suffocated while his heart was still beating. The first real worry is shown in Dr. Whitfield's journal entry for that day. 3rd patient in 8 months, all plantation owners, all sudden deaths with no clear cause. Hartford showed signs of acute respiratory failure, possibly cardiac in origin, but the sudden onset and rapid progression suggests something more than natural disease. Patient had no history of heart trouble, no recent illness, no explanation for sudden collapse. Examined food stores and found nothing suspicious. Questioned kitchen staff and received no useful information. Cannot shake feeling that something is wrong here, but cannot identify what. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution, sudden origin. His fellow deacon spoke at his funeral at Hartford's church, saying that God had taken him too soon as part of his mysterious plan. He left behind a plantation that his widow couldn't legally run and 3 kids under the age of 10. The estate went through probate, and this time Samuel Kincaid was sold to a buyer who had been looking for him. James Whitlock didn't believe in coincidence. Whitlock was different from the other buyers. He was 10 years younger, born in Texas. went to a military academy in Virginia, and came back home to build his own plantation through careful planning and risk-taking. He had 42 slaves, which was fewer than Hartford, but he ran his business like a soldier would, keeping detailed records of everything that happened on the plantation, including the health, behavior, and productivity of each slave. Whitlock asked questions when he heard that the Hartford estate was closing down. He became interested when he found out that Samuel Kincaid was being sold from his third estate in a row. He became interested when he found out that all 3 of the previous owners had died of natural causes within weeks of buying Samuel. On the 3rd of February 1851, James Whitlock paid $275 for Samuel Kincaid, which was a very low price at the time. This was because of the growing rumors about bad luck. Whitlock took Samuel to a plantation where he said he would be strictly observed. Samuel was given his own cabin, separate from the other enslaved people. Whitlock's personal servant made his food and brought it to him. His work kept him busy and visible all day long. Whitlock also made sure to talk to Samuel every day, asking questions, watching how he responded, and looking for any sign of the threat he thought was there. Whitlock said during their first conversation, while standing outside Samuel's cabin with armed overseers nearby, "You've had bad luck with your previous owners. 3 men dead. Some people might call that a pattern." Samuel kept his eyes down and his voice steady. "I don't know anything about that, Master. I just did what I was told. But they all died. Caffrey, Chandler, Hartford, all within weeks of buying you. They all got sick suddenly, and the doctor couldn't figure out why." Whitlock stopped and looked at Samuel's face for a reaction. "You know what I think? I think you're either the unluckiest slave in Texas or the most dangerous. Just trying to do my work, Master. Don't want any trouble. Good, because I'm watching you, Samuel. Every hour of every day, you're being watched. If you sneeze wrong, I'll know about it. If you so much as look at someone sideways, I'll know. And if anything happens to me—" Whitlock leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If anything happens to me, they won't wait for a trial. They'll hang you from the nearest tree and ask questions later. Do you understand?" "Yes, Master." Whitlock stood up straight, happy that he had made his point. He had warned the slave, shown that he was in charge, and set up a system to watch for any strange behavior. It was a sensible way to deal with an unreasonable problem, like the kind of military thinking that had helped him at the academy. It didn't help him live. Samuel was watched all the time for 11 weeks. He did the work he was told to do, which included building a new barn, fixing up the slave quarters, and doing general upkeep around the plantation. He ate food that was made in a different kitchen than the rest of the house. He slept alone in his cabin, but there was a guard outside. He didn't give Whitlock any reason to complain or any proof that he had done something wrong. But Whitlock himself started to change. He was worn out from always being on guard. He had trouble sleeping, jumped at strange noises, and checked his food over and over again before eating. His wife saw that he had become paranoid, jumping at shadows and making wild accusations against servants who had worked for him faithfully for years. In his daily reports, Whitlock's boss said that he seemed nervous and on edge, not himself, like a man expecting attack at any moment. On the 19th of April, 1851, James Whitlock fired his food tester, a young slave boy he had hired for that job. He did this because he thought the constant watching made him look stupid. He had dinner with his wife and kids, then went to his study to go over some accounts. He spent 2 hours working on his detailed plantation records. Whitlock's wife heard a crash in the study around 10 that night. She saw her husband on the floor, shaking, with his eyes rolled back in his head and foam at his mouth. He died before she could call for help. His body was still twitching, and the doctor later said that the symptoms were consistent with epileptic seizure or possible poisoning, though the patient had no history of seizures and no evidence of poison could be found. That night, Dr. Whitfield's journal entry marks a turning point. 4th death in less than 1 year, all connected to the same enslaved man. This cannot be coincidence. This cannot be natural disease. Something is happening here that I cannot explain through medicine. Have examined the body, found no evidence of poison or violence. Have questioned all household staff, discovered nothing suspicious. And yet, the patient is dead, and Samuel Kincaid remains alive and apparently healthy. I no longer know what I'm looking at. I no longer know if I'm seeing murder or some curse. All I know is that recommending legal action against a slave without evidence would be professional suicide, and yet, doing nothing seems equally impossible. Have recorded cause of death as sudden seizure of unknown origin. May God forgive me if I'm wrong. But D. Che, 22, the estate was sold. Samuel was sold again, and the rumors that had started as quiet talk spread to all the slave communities in 3 counties. Samuel Kincaid could not be owned. Samuel Kincaid killed his masters without even touching them. Samuel Kincaid was death itself, walking through the plantation system like divine vengeance disguised as property. George Pwitt, the 5th buyer, paid $150 for Samuel, even though everyone told him he was buying his own death. He was not related to Wallace Pwitt, the Caffrey overseer. Pwitt was either brave or stupid, or he was so far in debt that he didn't care and needed cheap labor no matter what. He lived for 6 weeks before dying from what doctor? Whitfield called acute respiratory distress following sudden onset of symptoms consistent with pneumonia, though patient showed no signs of illness prior to collapse. The 6th buyer, Nathan Cross, paid $90 for Samuel and died 3 weeks later from what the doctor called paralysis of unknown origin, beginning in extremities and progressing to vital organs with unusual rapidity. The 7th buyer, William Stokes, was the last person to ever buy Samuel Kincaid. He paid $65 for a slave that everyone in the county knew would bring death with him. We thought we had seen it all, but the horror in East Texas is getting worse. If this story is making you shiver, send this video to a friend who likes dark mysteries. Also, please hit the like button to show your support for our content and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. William Stokes would do something that none of the previous owners had been able to do. He would live long enough to ask Samuel Kincaid directly how he did it. Let's find out what happens next. William Stokes was going to die anyway. The former Georgia planter, who was 58 years old, moved to Texas in 1849 with his wife, 3 adult children, and 17 enslaved people. He wanted to rebuild his fortune after losing it to bad cotton prices and bad investments. He had bought a piece of land 40 miles south of Marshall in Cherokee County that wasn't quite good enough for cotton and had already been logged out by previous owners. He had 2 years of bad harvests, saw his children leave him for better opportunities in New Orleans, and saw his wife die of consumption in the spring of 1851. By August of that year, William Stokes knew he had maybe 6 months before the creditors took his worthless land. He heard about a slave being sold cheap in Marshall because of rumors that no one sensible believed. He knew his body was failing because he couldn't stop coughing, couldn't keep the weight on, and felt like he was climbing a mountain every day. He knew he was going to die alone on his worthless land, having failed at everything that was important to him. William Stokes bought Samuel Kincaid from the auctioneer in Marshall for $65, which was less than a quarter of what he would normally pay. He then took him back to Cherokee County and did something that none of the previous owners had thought of. He asked questions, not the scary questions Whitlock had asked, or the probing questions that assumed guilt. Stokes, on the 3rd night they were together, offered Samuel a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that most slaves got, and talked to him like a person. They were sitting on the porch of a house that was falling apart around them. Stokes said, "You killed 6 men. His voice was calm and didn't show any anger or blame. I know it. You know it. Every slave in 3 counties knows it. What I can't figure out is how." Samuel sat still, holding his coffee cup, and trying to figure out if this was another trap. Stokes kept looking out at fields that had gone to weed and said, "I'm dying anyway. I've got maybe 6 months before the drugs or the bank kill me, so I'm not afraid of you. I'm curious." He looked right at Samuel. "How did you do it?" There was a long pause between them, broken only by the sound of cicadas and a dog barking in the distance. Then Samuel spoke, and his voice dropped the dialect he had worked hard to keep for 18 months. "You really want to know? I really do. And if I tell you, you'll have me hanged." Stokes laughed, a wet sound that turned into a coughing fit. He shook his head when he got better. "Boy, I'll be dead before any trial could happen. And even if I wasn't, who's going to believe a dying man's confession? They'd say the consumption had rotted my brain." He took a sip of his coffee. "So, how does a slave kill 6 owners and not get caught?" Samuel looked at the old man's face, looking for the trap, the trick, and the betrayal that he had learned to expect from his whole life. He only found a tired man who was really interested in what he had to say. Samuel said quietly, "You don't poison them. That's what everyone thinks, but poison leaves traces. Doctor examines the body, finds evidence. You hang. You don't hurt them physically, because that leaves marks. You don't steal, because they check your cabin. You don't run, because that admits guilt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you do is make them afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of you. Of death. Of the thing they think you might do." Samuel's voice had a cold, analytical tone that hadn't been there before. Everyone knew Thomas Caffrey had headaches. He took the same dose of laudanum every night at the same time. I didn't touch his medicine. I just asked questions. Careful questions about his headaches, his symptoms, and how bad they'd gotten. I asked the house servants and the other field hands to make sure those questions would get back to him, like I was studying him and learning about his weakness. And he started thinking about dying. He started worrying that the next headache might be the one that killed him. He started looking at every symptom and every pain, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Samuel's eyes were still on something far away. He took his usual laudanum that night, but he also took extra because he was scared, because the headache was worse than usual, because fear makes pain worse. Took enough to stop his heart in his sleep. Stokes absorbed this, his expression unreadable. You killed him with his own fear. I made him aware of what was already killing him, the laudanum addiction, the headaches that got worse every month. The dose he kept increasing because the pain kept growing. He would have died anyway, maybe in a year, maybe 2. I just made him die sooner, on my schedule. Chandler? Same principle, different method. He took calomel for his stomach, mercury medicine that was slowly poisoning him anyway. Everyone takes it. Nobody thinks about what it does over time. I just made him aware of his symptoms, made him think about organ failure, made him scared enough to take extra doses when the pain got worse. Samuel's voice remained flat, clinical. Fear causes stress. Stress causes stomach problems. Stomach problems make you take more medicine. Medicine kills you. I just started the wheel spinning. Hartford? Hartford was harder. He didn't have an obvious weakness, didn't take medicine regularly, but he was pious. Believed in God's judgment, believed in sin and punishment. So I let him see things that made him question his own righteousness. Small things. A conversation he overheard about slaves, discussing Judgment Day. A Bible verse left open in his office to passages about false prophets, questions asked about whether slavery was truly Christian, asked where he'd hear them, but never directly to him. Samuel paused. Made him doubt himself, made him question his salvation, made him start seeing signs of God's displeasure everywhere. The stress triggered his heart, not poison, not violence, just fear, eating him alive from inside. Stokes sat still and thought about what he was hearing. Whitlock was easy. He was already paranoid. Just had to feed that paranoia. Make him see threats everywhere. Keep him in a constant state of alert until his body broke down from the stress. Puit and Cross were variations on the same theme. Find the weakness, make them conscious of it, let their own fear do the work. Samuel finally turned to look at Stokes directly. Fear is the most dangerous poison there is. It doesn't leave any traces, and it doesn't need a weapon. It just needs someone who is already sick, dying, and carrying the thing that will kill them. All you have to do is make them see it. The only sound that broke the silence was Stokes's heavy breathing. The old man finally nodded slowly. He said, "You didn't kill anyone. You're something worse. You're a mirror. You show men what's already killing them, and let them finish the job themselves," Samuel said. "I'm a slave who won't let anyone own me. That's all I've ever been. And now you're here, on my worthless land, waiting for me to die of consumption so you can be sold again." Stokes laughed again, that wet, terrible sound. "Except I'm not going to die that way." Samuel's face didn't change, but the air between them changed. Stokes said, "I'm going to set you free. Tomorrow, I'm going to take you to Jefferson, get the papers drawn up, manumit you legally, let you walk out of here a free man before I die, and my creditors seize every asset I own." He stood up, joints cracking, supporting himself on the porch railing. "You want to know why? Because what you did, it's the most brilliant revenge I've ever heard. You turned the system against itself, used their own weapons, their own medicine, their own fears, and you made them kill themselves while looking guilty of nothing." "They'll never let me stay free," Samuel said. "Free black man in Texas, with no papers proving how he got that way? They'll sell me back into slavery within a month." "Then you go north, get to Mexico, get to a free state, get somewhere they can't touch you." Stokes turned to go inside, then stopped. "You know what's really scary? It's not that you killed 6 men. It's that you showed that slavery doesn't work. You can't really own a man who's smarter than you. You can't really control someone who knows your weakness better than you do. You're proof that the whole system is built on sand." He went inside and left Samuel on the porch with his coffee. That was the last time he would go to bed. 3 days later, William Stokes died before he could go to Jefferson to file the manumission papers. He died of consumption, just like everyone thought he would. His body finally gave up after months of getting worse. There was nothing strange or suspicious about his death. It was just the natural progression of a disease that had been killing him since before he ever heard of Samuel Kincaid. But what happened next made clear what the previous 7 deaths had hidden: the full extent of Samuel's plan, and why he had never tried to escape, even though he had many chances. The county sheriff found something strange in the property records when the Stokes estate was sold off. This process took less than a week because there wasn't much value left. 3 days before he died, William Stokes wrote a will that gave everything to his creditors except for one thing. Samuel Kincaid was to be freed when Stokes died, and papers filed in Jefferson confirmed his status as a free man of color. The problem was that Stokes had died before he could sign the document in front of witnesses. Texas law said that a will that wasn't signed was not valid. Samuel was still property, and like any other asset, it could be seized and sold. Douglas Kymel, the sheriff since 1848, had a strange problem on his hands. He had a slave who had been there for 7 deaths of owners in a row, a pattern that everyone saw but no one could prove meant anything. He had a will from a dead man that wasn't signed, which made it seem like the dead man had planned to free this slave, and he was starting to feel more and more like something was very wrong with the whole thing. Kymel did what any smart cop would do. He put Samuel in the Marshall jail while he looked into the matter. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and found nothing illegal, but a lot of things that looked suspicious. Kymel talked to Dr. Whitfield, who said he was worried but didn't have any proof that anything was wrong. He talked to the wives of the dead men, who told him what they thought but couldn't give him any proof. He talked to the overseers, the other slaves, and the merchants who had worked with the dead men. What came out was a picture of an unlikely coincidence that had gone too far. 7 men who all died of natural causes within weeks of buying the same slave. 7 estates sold, 7 families broken up, and 7 fortunes lost, and 1 man, Samuel Kincaid, who was healthy and seemed to be innocent of everything except being there when death called. The legal issue was easy. Texas law said that Samuel hadn't done anything wrong because it couldn't prove he had. He hadn't raised a weapon, given poison, or hurt anyone. Legally speaking, it was just a coincidence that 7 men died after buying him. It was unfortunate and suspicious, but not a crime. The social issue was more complicated. The white people in Harrison County had to face an uncomfortable truth. They didn't have a way to deal with a threat they couldn't prove was real. If Samuel was guilty, he was guilty of taking advantage of the system that was supposed to keep him in check. If he was innocent, then 7 men died by random chance that was so unlikely that it couldn't have happened by chance. No one wanted to buy him, no matter what. 3 people bid on him at the auction on the 15th of September, 1851. They were all land speculators who wanted to sell him farther west, where his reputation hadn't spread yet. Thompson, a dealer, won the auction with a bid of $42, which was less than the price of a good mule. He planned to take him to San Antonio, where no one knew his past. But on the morning Samuel was supposed to be moved, something unexpected happened that would seal his fate and show the last part of his plan. 7 different plantations sent a group of enslaved people to the Marshall Courthouse to ask to speak with Sheriff Kimmel. It had never happened before. Slaves going directly to white authority and asking for an audience, acting as if they had the right to petition. The sheriff thought about whipping them for being so rude, but the way they acted made him think this was important enough to hear. What they said to him changed everything. Daniel was the spokesperson for the delegation. He had worked on the Chandler plantation and had met Samuel there for a short time. Daniel spoke carefully, using words that wouldn't get him or anyone else in trouble. He made it clear that the enslaved community knew things that the white community didn't. "Samuel Kincaid ain't killing nobody," Daniel said, looking down and speaking in a polite tone. "He ain't poisoning. He ain't hurting. He ain't doing nothing you could hang him for. But he's teaching." "Teaching what?" Kimmel asked. "Teaching us how to see what's already there, what's already killing them, the medicine they take, the food they eat, the stress they carry. Teaching us how to notice, how to ask questions, how to make them see what they already dying from." Daniel's voice stayed steady, but there was something underneath it, pride, maybe, or satisfaction. "He's not making anything new, he's just showing us what's always been there." Kimmel took this in and understood what it meant. He's training other slaves to do what he does. He's teaching us to survive by knowing our owners better than they know themselves. Teaching us to see their weaknesses, understand their fears, recognize what's killing them before they do. Daniel looked the sheriff in the eye for a moment, before looking down again. "We're not criminals, Sheriff. We're just watching the men who own us. That's not against the law." The sheriff didn't say anything because he knew that the threat wasn't Samuel Kincaid himself, but what he stood for and what he was spreading. The idea that enslaved people could study their owners, learn about their weaknesses, and use that knowledge to live longer than any one owner. It wasn't murder. It was evolution in slavery. That afternoon, Kimmel made his choice. He said that Samuel Kincaid was a threat to public order, not because he had committed a crime, but because he could cause a slave rebellion through what he called psychological manipulation. He told Samuel to stay in jail without a trial for as long as he wanted, using the power that sheriffs have to keep people safe. It was against the law, against the Constitution, and completely outside of Kimmel's legal powers. It was also the only answer that anyone could come up with. For the next 3 years, Samuel Kincaid was in jail in Marshall, without being charged, tried, or going through any legal process at all. The county paid for his care with a special tax that everyone knew was cheaper than letting him go back into the world. He wasn't a slave or a free person, a criminal or an innocent person. He was an anomaly that the system couldn't handle through normal means. And then the war started. The Civil War came to Marshall slowly, mostly because it hurt the economy more than it hurt the military. The town was too far from the main battlefields to see real fighting, but it felt the war's effects through conscription, inflation, and the slow collapse of the plantation economy that had kept it going. Prices for cotton went up and then down. Money lost all its value. The Confederate government took supplies, slaves, and tools by force. And in February 1863, as Union victories piled up and the Confederacy was willing to do anything to gain an edge, someone in Richmond remembered a jail in Marshall, Texas, that held a strange prisoner. The letter came from a military courier and was addressed to Sheriff Kimmel. It had the seal of the Confederate War Department on it. It asked, meaning ordered the transfer of Samuel Kincaid to Richmond to talk about military intelligence issues related to enemy psychological operations. Kimmel knew what the Confederacy really wanted to know. Could they use Samuel's methods as weapons? Could Confederate agents working behind Union lines learn how to use psychological manipulation to kill 7 slave owners? Could it be used to kill Union officers, Northern politicians, or anyone else the Confederacy needed to kill without leaving any proof? The sheriff wrote back and said no to the transfer because he was worried about public safety. Richmond got a direct order from the Secretary of War. Kimmel wrote again, this time explaining in detail what Samuel had done and why letting him go would be dangerous, even for the Confederacy. 3 weeks later, Richmond sent a response. They didn't care about the little things. They had to have the weapon. Samuel Kincaid was freed from the Marshall Jail on the 15th of March, 1863, and taken into Confederate custody. He was taken east under military guard, first by wagon and then by rail through a Confederacy that was already starting to fall apart. By the time he got to Richmond in early April, Union troops were getting a better hold on the Mississippi River, and it was clear that the Confederacy's days were numbered. There is no official record of what happened in Richmond, but letters, diaries, and random references in Confederate documents can help us piece together what happened. Intelligence officers talked to Samuel and asked him about his methods and how he did things in detail. He was helpful, clear, and seemed to be honest, which meant that the information he gave was useless to the Confederates. Samuel told them that his methods needed him to know a lot about each target, watch them for a long time, and be in situations where he could change the victim's conditions. He couldn't teach Confederate agents how to do what he'd done because it depended on being property, being in owners' homes, and being trusted enough to be invisible. He had taken advantage of certain weaknesses in certain men by gathering information over weeks or months of careful observation. You couldn't use that as a weapon in war. You couldn't teach agents to use it against enemy officers. It wasn't a way to kill someone. It was a way to stay alive by slowly learning how the system that enslaved him worked. The Confederate intelligence officers figured out that they had been sent a philosophical problem that looked like a tactical asset. They couldn't use Samuel Kincaid, copy his methods, or turn what he did into a weapon. They could only admit that he had shown something the Confederacy needed to deny, that enslaved people could use their minds to understand and beat their enslavers. They let him go in Richmond on the 23rd of April, 1863. They gave him papers that said he was free and told him that if he was caught in Confederate territory again, he would be sold back into slavery right away. Samuel left Richmond with those papers and nothing else. The city was already showing signs of the siege that would eventually fall upon it. Food shortages and rising prices were making life more and more difficult every day. He didn't have any money, resources, or connections, but he still had what he always had: intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand people better than they understood themselves. After Richmond, the historical record loses track of Samuel Kincaid. There are no other legal documents with his name on them, such as bills of sale, arrest records, or a death certificate. He disappeared into the chaos of the last 2 years of the Civil War, like a ghost who had shown that the strange institution could be beaten one owner at a time with nothing more than careful observation and the use of fear as a weapon. But his legacy lived on. After the war, when federal troops and Freedmen's Bureau agents came to Texas as part of Reconstruction, something strange happened in the counties around Marshall. Freedmen, who used to be slaves, started to show an unusual understanding of the businesses, debts, and weaknesses of their former owners. They knew which plantations had gone bankrupt, which former slaveholders were in trouble, and which white families could be used or bargained with. They knew because they had been taught to pay attention, watch, and understand that to stay alive, you had to know your enemy better than they knew themselves. Samuel Kincaid's name was never mentioned in the teaching, but his methods spread through the slave communities like a virus, moving from plantation to plantation and person to person, changing how enslaved people thought about their relationship with power. The National Archives has records from the Freedmen's Bureau in Harrison County that show dozens of cases where people who had been slaves successfully negotiated for land, wages, or compensation by showing that they knew a lot about their former owners' financial situations. They knew about debts that weren't obvious, mortgages on property, and business partnerships that had gone bad. They knew because they had been watching, listening, and understanding. Not as property, but as smart people stuck in an unfair system. A very detailed case from 1866 was about a freedman named Isaac who had worked on the Chandler plantation. Isaac showed the former overseer a complete record of the plantation's finances for the past 5 years, including crop yields, sales prices, and debts that were still owed. This was when the overseer tried to cheat him out of promised wages. He had memorized it all, piece by piece, year by year, waiting for the time when that knowledge would come in handy. The overseer had to pay because he found out that information he thought was safely hidden in ledgers that illiterate slaves couldn't read. Isaac later told the bureau agent that he had learned how important it was to pay attention from a man who had come through once and taught us that knowing was surviving. The white people in Marshall had a hard time adjusting to this new reality, where their old property knew all about their weaknesses. Some former slaveholders abandoned their land entirely, unable to negotiate with people who understood their desperation too well. Others changed, realizing that the freedmen they had once owned were now partners in an economy that had fallen apart and needed to be rebuilt. But all of them learned that the relationship between enslaved and enslaver had never been as one-sided as they'd believed. The people they thought were property had always been watching them, learning about them, and waiting for the right time to use that knowledge. County records from that time show a huge rise in land transfers, contract disputes, and negotiations where freedmen had more power than expected. Some of this was just basic economics. When the plantation system fell apart, everyone had to fight to stay alive. But a lot of it showed a change in the balance of power that the former slaveholders found very disturbing. In 1868, a traveling journalist from Philadelphia visited Marshall while documenting Reconstruction in Texas. His articles, which were published in a number of northern newspapers, talked about how the freedmen in Harrison County were more knowledgeable about their former masters' affairs than would be expected from people who were supposedly kept in ignorance. He interviewed several freedmen, who spoke carefully about the importance of observation, about learning to read people instead of books, and about survival through understanding. None of them said Samuel Kincaid by name, but the journalist noted that several of them talked about a teacher who came through during the war years and showed them that seeing was as powerful as reading. The journalist also talked to former slaveholders who complained about uppity freedmen who knew too much about private business affairs. One former plantation owner who didn't want to be named told the journalist, "We thought we controlled everything because we controlled their bodies. But we never realized they were controlling information we didn't even know they could access. They knew our debts, our fears, our weaknesses. They were always watching, always learning, and we were too blind to see it." Dr. Ambrose Whitfield lived until 1874, when he died of natural causes at the age of 67. His journal, which was found after he died, had a last entry from September 1851 that said, "I have come to the conclusion that what happened with Samuel Kincaid was not murder in any legal sense, but something more disturbing, a demonstration that the enslaved understand their enslavers better than we understand ourselves. This knowledge cannot be unlearned. This understanding cannot be erased, and I fear that future generations will discover what it means when the observed become more knowledgeable than the observers." But Whitfield also wrote something else in those final pages. A passage that suggests he'd come to understand the full scope of what Samuel had accomplished. The true horror of the Kincaid case was never about the death of 7 men. It was about the awakening of consciousness among people we'd convinced ourselves lacked the capacity for such sophistication. Every slave who learned to watch, to listen, to understand their owner's vulnerabilities, they all became potential threats to a system that depended entirely on assumed superiority. Samuel Kincaid didn't just kill his owners, he killed the illusion that slavery was sustainable in the presence of intelligent resistance, and that knowledge, once spread, can never be contained again. The 7 widows who lived through the war and Reconstruction saw the end of slavery and the loss of their fortunes. Some got married again, some moved away, and some lived the rest of their lives in worse conditions. No one ever said in public that their husbands might have been eliminated instead of just unlucky. If they did that, they would be admitting that the system they had relied on was weak in ways they had never thought of. Catherine Caffrey, the daughter of Thomas Caffrey, married a Union officer during Reconstruction, and moved to Ohio, where she lived until 1889. A letter she wrote to her cousin in 1873, which was found in a family archive in Cincinnati, said, "I sometimes think about the slave father bought that spring, the one who was there when father died. I've read enough now, learned enough about medicine and psychology to understand what might have happened. Father's laudanum addiction was killing him slowly. Perhaps that man simply made him aware of it. Perhaps he did nothing at all, except exist as a reminder of mortality. I'll never know, but I think about it often, about how we convinced ourselves we were superior, while being so terribly, vulnerably human." Sheriff Douglas Kimmel was in office until 1867, when he was removed during Reconstruction. He died in 1882, and in his last years he kept saying that holding Samuel Kincaid without trial was right, necessary, and the only way to stop what he called psychological rebellion. History has not been kind to his reasoning, but his grandson gave the Harrison County Historical Society his private papers in 1923. In them is a letter he wrote in 1870 that shows he understood what he had seen more deeply. "I kept that man in jail for 3 years without charging him with a crime, because I couldn't prove he had done anything wrong. But I knew he had destroyed the basic idea that our society was built on, that we were smarter, more capable, and more deserving of power than the people we enslaved. He proved that wrong just by living and surviving." The news of his survival and what he had done spread like wildfire through every slave quarter in the county. I couldn't stop that. No one could. As soon as word got out that a slave had beaten the system 7 times, the system itself became weak. The courthouse in Marshall is still there, but it has been fixed up and put to new use. The auction block is no longer there. The ledgers that kept track of Samuel's sales have been kept, and they show how prices fell and how desperate the men who bought him became, even though they knew his past. They're remnants of a system that thought people could be property, that intelligence could be owned, and that some people were naturally suited for slavery. Samuel Kincaid disproved each of those assumptions, not by using violence or running away, but by understanding. He demonstrated that the most perilous weapon an enslaved individual could wield was knowledge of medicine, psychology, and the fears that tormented their purported owners. It doesn't matter if he lived through the war and found freedom in the North, died in Richmond during the last siege, or lived out his days somewhere the records never reached. What he did is what matters. He showed that slavery made people weak, that every act of ownership gave the owned a chance to understand the owner, and that fear was a poison that didn't need a bottle and left no trace. 7 men bought Samuel Kincaid, and 7 men died. He didn't kill them. He showed them what was already killing them, and let their own fear finish the job. This mystery teaches us that the scariest weapon isn't always the one you can see. Sometimes it's the knowledge that people have that you think they can't use against you. What do you think about this story? Do you think that everything was said? Is it possible that Samuel lived longer than the historical record shows and taught others how to do things during the chaotic years of Reconstruction? Please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.